Now for the balance sheet equation, I'm going to use the acronym for this, BSE, balance sheet equation. So we got assets, what we own. We got liabilities, what we owe. And then we got shareholders' equity, which is what the owners own. And there's a lot of synonyms here. Shareholders' equity is sometimes called book value, sometimes called net worth, sometimes called residual claim, and we'll make that clear in a second why. So what this says is that assets equals liabilities plus shareholders' equity, A equals L plus SE. Now, a good way to think about this, especially when you're starting off, is think about yourself. What kind of assets do you own? Well, maybe you own a car, okay? And maybe when you bought that car, you took out a loan on that car, and so your shareholders' equity on that car is going to be the difference between the the car value and the loan balance, and that'll be your net worth. So that's the sense that stockholders' equity or shareholders' equity is net worth. Some more formal definitions here of assets and liabilities. Assets, there's three tests for an asset. You have a right of ownership, so you own your car. Your car is associated with future benefits, so it's not just complete junker, but you can drive that car around, okay? And the value of that car is measured with reasonable accuracy. So that's an asset. Cases where assets are not thought to be measurable with reasonable accuracy is when you make investments in research and development. Clearly those investments have benefits, but the accounting system doesn't think of those benefits as being measurable with reasonable accuracy. So we don't put, in the US in particular, we don't put any assets on our balance sheet having to do with R&D investments. So play with those definitions when you have a chance. Liabilities, also three tests. It's a past transaction, so that I've done something to incur the liability. So I borrowed money from you, and it involves a future obligation. In the future, I have to pay you money back, or maybe I'll deliver you a good, or maybe I'll deliver you a service. So those are our two tests. And then again, notice here there's a measurable with reasonable accuracy test. So most liabilities will be on the balance sheet. The one liability that we've kind of seen earlier today that won't be on the balance sheet is if you're sued, okay? So if you're sued, there's a past transaction, there's a future obligation, you're going to probably have to pay out some kind of cash or settle it otherwise. But the accounting system says that lawsuit is not measurable with reasonable accuracy, so that's not going to be a liability. It'll be something called a contingent liability, which will show up in the footnotes to our financial statements. And then we want a definition of shareholders' equity. So remember, shareholders' equity, which is, I'm going to use the acronym SE, is equal to the difference between assets and liabilities just by the balance sheet equation, which says assets equals liabilities plus stockholders' equity. So we can rearrange that to be stockholders' equity equals assets minus liability. And it says here that shareholders are the residual claimant to the firm's assets. And what that means is if the firm liquidates or goes into bankruptcy, we'll sell off all the assets and we'll get some cash with the proceeds of the sales of those assets. And then we'll pay off all the liabilities. And to the extent that there's anything left over after we sell off all the assets and pay off all the liabilities, we, the stockholders, are the residual claimant to that. We get what's left over. And then just for accounting purposes, we're going to divide shareholders' equity into something called contributed capital. That's what happens when you issue stock, and something called retained earnings, which is what happens when you keep your earnings within the firm. So contributed capital, again, comes from the issuance of stock. Retained earnings are profits that we haven't given back to our shareholders as dividends. So that's a definition of assets, definition of liability, definition of stockholders' equity.